Today, I want to talk to you about Thomas Aquinas's 5 ways to argue for God's existence. And I hesitate to do this because I feel as if I am not as much of an expert as I should be on these things, and that there are many people in the world who probably could explain this way better than I could. But I also thought that it's been helpful for my students sometimes to hear at least my interpretation of the 5 ways. And so hopefully it'll be of some use also to you. So what I'm going to do is talk about the Kalam cosmological argument, just very briefly review it, so that we can see the difference between the Kalam cosmological argument and Aquinas's 5 ways. And then I'll talk about each one of Aquinas's 5 ways: his argument to the unmoved mover, his argument to an uncaused cause, his argument to a necessary being, his argument to a perfect being, and finally his argument to an intelligent being. And then I'll conclude my remarks by raising various objections to the 5 ways. So, is it reasonable to believe that God exists? The Kalam cosmological argument would give a yes to that. And the argument is fairly simple, that whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, and therefore the universe has a cause. And I have previously talked about the Kalam cosmological argument, so I won't bother going over that again now. But if both premises are true, then the conclusion does follow. This is a logically valid argument. So the question is whether both premises are true. And I gave elsewhere, again, different reasons for thinking that both premises are true. But Thomas Aquinas disagreed with this argument. He thought that the minor premise, that the universe began to exist, was a premise that we couldn't know through philosophy to be true. Given the science of Thomas Aquinas' day, there was no scientific evidence in the 13th century that the universe began to exist. So maybe today Aquinas would have a different view, but certainly historically, the real Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century would not have affirmed that the universe began to exist as something true and known philosophically. Now, he did believe it, but that was a matter not of philosophy, but rather of theology. In any case, he would not have held that the minor premise could be shown to be true through reason. And so we too today can ask, well, what if contemporary science is wrong? And what if all of a sudden they begin to believe that the universe is eternal? If we reject that minor premise, that the universe had a beginning, how, or could rather, we understand that God exists? Would it still be reasonable to think that God exists? Well, Aquinas' answer is yes, it would be reasonable. And here's why he thinks that. Even though Aquinas rejects the Kalam cosmological argument, he thinks that there's good reasons to think that there has to be a supreme being. And he argues that there are 5 ways to know this. You could think of the 5 ways as 5 different bits of evidence that all point to the identity of a particular person as the one who did the killing. So you might say, first of all, we have the evidence of the bullet fragments that are collected that are exactly the same as the gun owned by this individual. And secondly, you might say we have the footprints going from the scene of the crime, and those footprints are exactly the same size as the individual in question. And thirdly, maybe we can say we see a witness who saw a person exactly of the description of this individual who was at the scene of the crime running away. And fourth, maybe we have evidence from this person's diary entries that they said in their diary that they killed this person. And maybe fifth, we have a videotape that shows someone looking exactly similar to the person in question, entering the scene of the crime and then leaving the scene of the crime at just the right time. So you can imagine that a prosecuting attorney would say, look, we've got 5 different lines of evidence that all point to this individual as the one who did the killing. Aquinas has a similar view in that he thinks that there's at least 5 different ways in which we could come to the conclusion that God exists. So let's take a look at those and see whether you agree with them or disagree. We'll take a look. The 5 ways of Aquinas are: first, the argument for the unmoved mover from change. Secondly, the argument to an uncaused cause that makes use of the principle of causality. Third, an argument that concludes to a necessary being, and this makes use of a distinction between necessity and contingency. Fourth, Aquinas argues from the grades of perfection that there has to be a perfect being. And finally, Aquinas appeals to the order in the universe in order to conclude that there has to be some kind of intelligent being who is ordering the universe. So let's take a look at these, each one in turn. I'm going to start off talking about the second way, because I think in some ways it's easier to understand. So we can break down the second way in the following premises, and then I'll go over each of these premises. First, there are things that are caused. Everything caused is caused by another. Either there is an infinite regress in causes, or there is an uncaused cause. There cannot be an infinite regress in causes. Therefore, there is an uncaused cause, which Aquinas calls God. So let's break down this second way and think a little bit more about it. There are things that are caused. Think about this baby. A baby is a being that is caused. A baby's caused by her mother and her father. And there are many other things that are caused, of course. You and I are both caused. Phones are caused, cars are caused, trees are caused. Really, everything we see and hear are things that are caused. So this premise is not really that controversial. This is something that's quite obvious, that there are things that are caused. Everything caused is caused by another. So we take the baby again, the baby is caused by something else. And then you might say, well, couldn't the baby just cause herself to come into existence? Well, that's not going to work. And the reason it doesn't work is that if something does not exist, then that thing cannot do anything. So think of something that does not exist. So I'm guessing that you're not a great-great-grandparent. So your great-great-granddaughter does not exist. Now, maybe someday she will, but right now she doesn't exist. And so your great-great-granddaughter cannot go get you a cup of coffee, cannot help you with any of the things you need to be done. So because your great-granddaughter can't do anything, your great-granddaughter also cannot cause anything, right? She can't cause the dishes to be unloaded from the dishwasher. And if your great-granddaughter cannot cause anything, well, then your great-granddaughter cannot cause herself. So something that is caused is requiring something else outside of it to cause it. Everything caused is caused by another. Now, Aquinas relies on a distinction that we have to clarify between two different kinds of causes. The two different kinds of causes are per accidens causes and per se causes. So if we think about dominoes that are all lined up, right? The first domino hits the second one, and that hits the third one, and that hits the fourth one, and that hits the fifth one, and so on and so forth on down the line. That's an example of per accidens causality. By contrast, if we think of a train, we have the locomotive that pulls the train behind it, or the car behind it, and then that car in turn pulls the car behind it, and that car pulls the car behind it. But if the locomotive stops pulling and stops entirely, well, then all the rest of the trains all the rest of the cars that make up the train also are going to stop. So human generation is a great example of per accidens causality, right? The baby is caused by the dad, who in turn is caused by his dad, who in turn is caused by his dad, who's in turn caused by his dad. So the baby, you might say in the per accidens order of causality, is caused by a number of people, including the great-great-grandfather. Now, in a per accidens order of causality, you can remove one of the prior causes and the posterior causes continue to exist. So what I mean is great-great-grandfather can die, but the father can still be alive, right? The grandfather can die, but the baby is still alive. So you can remove a per accidens cause, and the subsequent causes can just continue to exist. By contrast, in a per se order of causality, if you remove one of the causes, all the subsequent causes that depend on that cause also are suppressed. So an example of that might be a glass of, or a bottle of water. So the water is getting caused to be where it is by the plastic bottle. The plastic bottle is getting caused to be where it is by the wooden table. The wooden table is caused to be where it is by the floor. So if you had a trapdoor floor and the floor just disappeared, well, that would cause the table to no longer hold up the plastic bottle, and then it would cause the water in the plastic bottle to be moved and changed. So in a per se order of causality, all the subsequent causes depend upon the prior causes. So let's think about a plant that's hanging from a ceiling. Would this be an example of a per se or per accidens chain of causality? Well, the plant is only hanging there because it's getting caused to be hanging there. And so you might say, you could kind of break it down. Link A, which is most near the ceiling, causes link B to hold up link C, and link C in turn causes link D to be held up. And that is all related to the plant, holding up the plant. So this is, you might say, an example of asymmetry. That is to say, the plant depends on C, D, B, and A, but A doesn't depend on B or C or D or the plant. In other words, A can still do what it's doing even if the plant is removed. Whatever causal power, say, B has is derived from A. Whatever causal power D has is derived from B. So in an essentially ordered series, in an essentially ordered per se series, the subsequent causes only have power in virtue of their preceding causes. So what this means is that all those causes are instrumental. The causes, the subsequent causes, or the cause B is instrumental to cause C working, and cause C is instrumental to D working. So again, this is in a per se causal series. So what causes you to continue to exist in the per se order of causality? So you were caused, of course, by your mom and dad and your grandparents and your great-grandparents, but your great-grandparents might no longer exist, and yet you continue to exist now. So that is an example of a per accidens order of causality. But what causes you to exist right now? Well, there's a bunch of things that cause you to exist right now. One of them is atmospheric pressure. If you were at the bottom of the ocean without a submarine, you would die immediately. And the reason is that the atmospheric pressure at the bottom of the ocean is radically different than the atmospheric pressure on the surface of the Earth. So part of what's causing you to exist right now is atmospheric pressure. In other words, right now you're getting caused to exist by atmospheric pressure. And atmospheric pressure is also something that is getting caused. So what causes atmospheric pressure? Well, temperature causes atmospheric pressure to change. And so if the temperature were radically different than it was, that would change the atmospheric pressure, and that would change you and maybe even kill you. So if we were on the surface of the sun, of course, we could not continue to exist. If we were in an absolutely freezing condition without coats and such, we also would cease to exist. So we are getting caused by atmospheric pressure, and atmospheric pressure in turn is getting caused by temperature. So we have, in other words, an essentially ordered per se causal series. Now, if there were only intermediate and derivative causes, then there would be no source from which all the causal powers of the intermediate causes could be derived. But then the derivative cause would not be able to cause anything. But the derivative causes certainly can cause things. In other words, the derivative causes like atmospheric pressure and like temperature can, in fact, cause things like us to continue to exist. So there cannot only be derivative causes. Or to put it differently, there cannot be only caused causes. There must be, in other words, an uncaused cause. So you can think about it in terms of sharing a pizza. When things are getting caused, they are receiving something from someone else. So if you're in a class and someone brings a pizza, then the person next to you might hand you the pizza and cause you to get it. And then you in turn can cause someone else to get a piece of pizza by handing down the pizza down the line. But somebody has to bring the pizza to the classroom in order for that sharing to occur. And in order for there to be caused causes, something has to be the first cause that is enabling the whole series of per se causes to continue to exist. So there cannot be an infinite regress in causes. A cause is either itself uncaused or itself also getting caused. If a cause is itself caused, well, then we've not yet explained what caused the cause. That is, if we're trying to figure out why human beings, like their caused being, continue to exist, and then we appeal to atmospheric pressure, which is another caused being, we're simply restating the problem at a different level. Thus, a sufficient explanation demands an uncaused cause. So, what do you think of this argument? Do you agree with the premises of the second way? It seems very, very hard to deny that there are some things that are getting caused, and everything that's getting caused is caused by another. Nothing can cause itself to exist. And either there is an infinite regress in causes, or there is an uncaused cause. But as we saw, there cannot be an infinite regress in the order of per se causality, because in an order of per se causality, all the subsequent causes depend on ultimately a first cause to have any causal power. So there is an uncaused cause, which Aquinas calls God. Now, let's take a look at a great objection to this argument from Bertrand Russell. Here's what Bertrand Russell said. If every cause has itself a further cause, one cannot in the same breath go on to say that there is none cause that has no further cause. So, in other words, who caused the uncaused cause? If everything has a cause, well, then God has a cause. So this is a classic objection to the second way. If everything has a cause, well, what caused God? But note, Thomas does not say everything has a cause. He also does not say every cause has itself a further cause. What Thomas claims is everything caused is caused by another. So who caused God? Well, that question seems to make sense, right? You can say it and people might understand what you mean, who caused God? But I think when we think about this question a little bit more carefully, it's pretty clear that this question actually does not make sense. It's a nonsense question, like how much does the number 4 weigh? Well, the number 4 doesn't have any weight, and so there is no answer to how much does the number 4 weigh. Even if atheism is correct, there is no answer to the question who caused God, because if atheism is right, there is no one who caused God. Some questions have no answer, like who is the father of Santa Claus? Or presumably, where did you bury your mother alive? Right? You didn't bury your mother alive. So there's no answer to that question. The question, in other words, presupposes a premise that is disputable. The questions like this have a false implicit supposition, in other words. So whether atheism is true or theism is true, the question who made God is a question with an implicit false presupposition. So let's take a look now at the first way. The first way is whatever is moved by another. There cannot be an infinite regress in movers. Therefore, there must be a first mover, which is called God. So let me break this first way down for you a little bit more. The first way, as Aquinas explicates it, talks about act and potency. And these terms might be illustrated by means of boiling water. So if the water is boiling, you might say the water is actually boiling, but it has the potency for being lukewarm. And as the boiling water cools off, that potency that it has for being lukewarm becomes actualized. So if we're talking about change, change is a combination of act and potency. Thomas talked about change as the act of it being in potency insofar as it is in potency. In other words, when we have motion or change, what we have is an actualization of a potency. So imagine a woman running down a path. At the beginning of the path, she is in potency to being halfway down the path. And then once she gets halfway down the path, she's actually halfway down the path. And then she has this new potency of maybe returning back to the beginning point. So what motion is the in-between state where you're not yet fully actualized, there's no motion there, and you're not merely potential, there's no motion there, but rather you're in between. You're in between point A and point B. You're in between the beginning of the path and the end of the path. You're in between, say, the lukewarm water and the boiling water. Now, the same distinction we made before, we can appeal to again, the distinction between per accidens and per se. So in a series of per se movers, everything is moved by the prior mover. So Thomas's example is a hand that moves a stick that moves a rock. So the hand needs to be moving the stick, which in turn needs to be moving the rock. And if you get rid of the hand or you get rid of the stick, then the rock doesn't move. So that's an example of per se movers, or in the case of a locomotive, right? The very beginning of the locomotive pulls the subsequent cars of the train. And if the locomotive stops dead in its tracks, well, the subsequent chains in the subsequent cars in the train also stop. Now, an objection to Thomas's view about the unmoved mover is, look, if everything moves, well, then what moves God? But Aquinas, of course, does not say that everything is in motion. He just says that some things are in motion. And this is very hard to deny, right? There are some things that are in motion, like cars and airplanes and all kinds of things. Nor does Aquinas say that everything is moved by something else, but only that whatever is in motion is moved by something else. Hence, it will not do to ask, doesn't that mean that God must be in motion, or what moves God? Again, Aquinas is not claiming that everything is moved, and so God could not be included in that category. In fact, there is nothing in Aquinas' premises that implies that God would have to be changing like everything else, or that he must be moved by something else. So what do you guys think of this first way, right? Whatever is moved by another. There cannot be an infinite regress in movers. Therefore, there must be a first mover, which is called God. The first way and the second way are similar in some respects. The first way is concerned to explain why things undergo change. And the second way is intended to explain why they exist at all. Whereas in the first way, the causal influence of the first cause is not something that occurred merely at some point in the past, but which exists here and now. The first way is meant to show that there's no motion or change which would occur here and now unless there were a first unmoved mover operating here and now. So we're operating in a per se order. The second way is meant to show that nothing would even exist here and now unless there were a first uncaused cause sustaining things in being here and now. So let's consider now the third way. The third way begins with the idea that some things are able to be and not to be because they are generated and corrupted. So those things are called contingent beings. So the baby we talked about earlier is a thing that is able to be or not to be, right? The baby didn't always exist, it got generated. And someday, hopefully a long time from now, the baby is going to die as an old person and they'll get corrupted. So we are examples of contingent beings. Another example of contingent being would be a tree, right? There's no trees that always existed, but rather trees are things that are able to be, they're able to get generated, and they're also able to be corrupted. They can get burned up. Now, not all things can be generated and corrupted, Aquinas says, because then they would have to generate themselves before they exist. So nothing can generate itself. Nothing can cause itself to come into existence. If something doesn't exist, like your great-great-granddaughter, then she can't cause anything. And if she can't cause anything, she can't generate anything. So not all things can be contingent beings. There must be something whose existence is necessary. And Aquinas says a necessary being either has existence from itself or from another, and therefore there is a necessary being whose necessity is from itself, whom we call God. So this third way, this argument from the contingency and necessity, is a way that later philosophers also took up, philosophers like Leibniz. So if you consider the question, why does the universe exist? What accounts for the existence of the universe? We can come to an understanding by considering, what would it be like if you were walking in the woods and you ran across a large ball? Well, you wouldn't just say, well, the ball just exists and that's the end of it. You'd say, well, why did this ball come into existence? How did this ball come into existence? What explains the existence of this ball? But if the ball were the size of the whole Earth, you have the very same problem. And if the ball were the size of the entire universe, you have the very same problem, the problem of explaining why this thing exists. And just as a ball is a contingent being, it doesn't have to exist. It got generated and it will get corrupted. So too, the universe is a contingent being. It did not always exist and it will not always exist. It's something that got generated and could, in principle, be corrupted. And so if we're going to explain the existence of such things, we need something outside of that system, a being that's not merely contingent, but a being that is necessary. So some things are able to be and not to be because they are generated and corrupted. Not all things can be generated and corrupted because then they would have to generate themselves before they exist. There has to be something outside the system, as it were, to give rise to the system. There must be something whose existence is necessary, a necessary being. And this necessary being either has existence from itself or from another, but if it's from another, you haven't yet explained it. And so there has to be a necessary being whose necessity is from itself, whom we call God. Let me quickly go over the fourth way and the fifth way. The fourth way is the proof from the grades of perfection of beings that notes that among beings there are some more and some less, good, true, noble, and the like. But things are said to be more or less in a certain way to the extent that they resemble some maximum, as a thing is said to be hotter according to it as it more nearly resembles that which is hottest. But in that case, it follows that there is something which is truest, something best, something noblest, and consequently something which is uttermost being. For those things that are greatest in truth are greatest in being. Now, the maximum within any genus is the cause of everything in that genus, as fire, which is the maximum of heat, is the cause of all things hot. So there must be something which is the cause of the being, goodness, and every other perfection of all beings, and this is what we call God. So let me try to break this one down for you as well. We have different grades of perfection, things that, for instance, are more or less good. Think of health, say. We can be more healthy or less healthy. And when we have standards like that, they have to resemble or approach some maximum. And the maximum, in a way, is the exemplary cause of the thing in question. So some philosophers have recast this fourth way, I think in a new way, called the moral argument for God's existence. If God does not exist, objective morals and values do not exist, but objective morals and values do exist, and therefore God exists. So let's break this down. The idea of objective morals and values are things that are really right or really wrong, independently of our subjectivity, not just the way we feel or our taste or our preference, but in fact, really good or really bad, really right or really wrong. But if God doesn't exist, there doesn't seem to be any stable standard for judgment about what is really right or what is really wrong. And this is, interestingly, a principle that is also endorsed by atheists like Jean-Paul Sartre. He famously said that if God does not exist, then all things are permissible. And so that's just another way of putting the premise of the moral argument. If God does not exist, objective morals and values do not exist. Now, do objective morals and values exist? Well, we might appeal to pretty universally widely held convictions that say racism is wrong or rape is wrong. If you believe those statements, not just that it's your preference or your taste, but that objectively speaking, those things are wrong, well, then you do hold that objective morals and values do exist. Finally, let's talk for a moment about the fifth way. Things which lack intelligence, such as natural bodies, act for an end. And this is evident from their acting always or nearly always in the same way, so as to obtain the best result. From this, it's plain that they act not fortuitously, but designedly, Aquinas says. But whatever lacks intelligence can only act for an end if it's directed by something which has intelligence, as the arrow is shot to its mark by the archer. So, therefore, some intelligent being exists by whom all natural things are directed to their end, and this being we call God. So let's break this one down too a little bit so we can maybe understand it a little more clearly. Think about paper burning. Paper burns at Fahrenheit 451. And this is something that paper does regularly, automatically. It's not as if paper sometimes turns to ice at Fahrenheit 451 and sometimes turns to rubber at Fahrenheit 451, but rather that paper catches fire at Fahrenheit 451. So in other words, you might say there's an orderly process in terms of how fire and paper interact at a certain temperature. Likewise, think of all the truths of physics and chemistry, right? In physics, force equals mass times acceleration. In chemistry, you can mix up certain chemicals and you get the same result over and over and over and over again. There is, in other words, an order in nature. Nature is not just random stuff happening. It's not just unpredictability, but rather nature shows an order. And if nature has an order, then nature must be ordered by some sort of power. But only an intelligent power can order something. I mean, think about the books in the library. If you went into a library and somebody said, oh, all the books on the shelves, they just happened to, there's a big earthquake and an explosion at a book factory, and all the books just landed on the shelves in this Dewey Decimal order. Well, that's absurd, right? If there's an order there, the order is placed there by an intelligence that orders it. But we do have an order in nature. And this is much more clear in our own day than it was in Aquinas' day. We know now, much better than Aquinas did in his day, how nature is filled with order. And not just nature in living things, but rather also nature in terms of non-living things like paper and fire and ice and water, etc. So Euclid said the laws of nature are but the mathematical thoughts of God. And that intuition, I think, is behind Aquinas's fifth way. There is an order in natural processes. Even a simple physical phenomena like the attraction between two particles would suffice for his purposes. And when we include non-organic processes, these are not subject to the survival of the fittest or any kind of Darwinian explanation, since they're not alive. What Thomas is saying is rather that it's impossible that every apparent causal regularity can be attributed to chance. And even chance itself presupposes a causal regularity. So this fifth way sometimes is recast by contemporary philosophers in terms of what's called the fine-tuning argument, that life in the universe would be impossible unless many of the different parameters, such as gravity, were fine-tuned to make life possible. And this fine-tuning cannot be accounted for by necessity. There's no necessity that the universe has to have gravity of a certain degree. And chance also does not account for it. And so we're left with the fine-tuning of the universe being best explained by means of design. Now, let me conclude today by objections to the five ways. One objection is polytheism. You might say to Aquinas, look, maybe you're right. Maybe there has to be an uncaused cause. But why does there have to be one uncaused cause? After all, the baby was caused not just by her mother, but also by her father. And so maybe there are two uncaused causes, or three, or 37. Moreover, why in the world should we think that the uncaused cause is exactly the same being as the unmoved mover? And why should we think that the unmoved mover is exactly the same being as the necessary being? And why should we think that the necessary being is also the same as the greatest good? And why in the world should we think that the greatest good is the same as the intelligence that orders the universe? So Aquinas' five ways seem to prove too much. They prove not that there is one God, but they prove polytheism. Another classic objection to Aquinas' five ways is that what he has done at best is prove the existence of the God of the philosophers. But most people care not about that, but about the God of Abraham, a God who knows us, a God who loves us, a God who interacts with us, a God who is able to care for us and to be someone we could pray to. But the uncaused cause seems very different than the God of Abraham. An unmoved mover seems very much unlike the God of Moses. And so even if Aquinas were right, that he proved some kind of God, it seems like at best a kind of force in the universe that's very different from the God of Abraham, the God of the Bible. And finally, if God really exists, how do we explain evil? I mean, if God is all powerful, he'd be able to get rid of all evil. If God is all good, he'd want to get rid of all evil. But clearly there is evil in the world. And so some people reject Aquinas' ideas about God because of the problem of evil. So this brings us to the end of today's discussion. Next time, we will continue our looking at Aquinas and see how he understands who God is. And we will talk about that next time.